Hi, welcome back to another Museum from Home program from the Charlotte Museum of History. Today we're really excited because it's a part of the Indigenous Peoples Week celebration. And today we actually get to come out to Town Creek Indian Mound State Historic Site to learn more about the people who have lived in North Carolina for thousands of years. And I'm standing here with Megan. Thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about where on earth we are.
We're in Mount Gilead, North Carolina, here in Montgomery County. This is a state historic site that is focused on the interpretation that goes back thousands of years.
And you say thousands of years. Are we talking 1,000 years? Are we talking longer than that? How long have people lived right here?
Well, about 10,000 years or longer people have been coming through this area. We focus the interpretation on about 1,000 years ago, give or take a few hundred, when people are living here in this one spot.
And what brought them here? What about this site is so appealing to people? Obviously, it's beautiful here.
Oh, it certainly is. So we are situated along the Little River, which is good for resources, both for food and fish and transportation. There's also a lot of natural resources around here, including prairie resources and forest resources. So there's a lot going for it.
And how do we know that people have been here quite this long? Obviously, you're an archaeologist by training, so tell me a little bit about that. How do we know what we know?
People left things behind. No matter how careful people are, there's usually some mark that can be found, and if not, then they're very careful. But people leave tools behind, they leave traces of fire and cooking, and through preservation, if the preservation is good or if the area has not been disturbed for these thousands of years, then archaeologists can come in and very carefully find some of these traces.
And what kinds of things have people found here on this site? What lets them know that the site was occupied and not just kind of a pass-through place for people?
Yes, so in addition to stone tools and ceramics, pottery itself is something that people don't start using until they're living in one place. It's pretty heavy to carry around. So there are alternatives when they're moving. There's also traces or evidence of buildings. So the post holes are where these large posts that are holding up structures. Those are still visible beneath the soil, and archaeologists can find those and map out where buildings used to stand in certain places.
And so you guys can actually see where these structures are. And I know today at Town Creek, you have reconstructed some of these buildings so we can actually see what the landscape looked like to someone who walked through here. Now, is this someone who lived here 10,000 years ago, or is this someone who lived here a little bit later when we walked through?
Later, about 1,000 years ago, before Europeans are coming in, but just about 1,900.
One of the things that immediately I recognized when I came in is actually over here behind me. There are two busts of individuals. Can you tell me a little bit about them?
Yes, these are two individuals that were found here through archaeology. They have been buried on the site, and these are facial reconstructions from these remains and the artifacts that they were found with. They were here during this time period of this Mississippian expression about 1,000 years ago. It's not, there's not a specific date for them.
And I understand that they're actually at a very specific height for a very specific reason.
Yes. So through physical remains, archaeologists can determine a person's height using the long bones and the body. And so these are the heights that these individuals would have stood when they were alive.
And I think what's so powerful about it is these people here, they had these incredible lives, all of these stories, but there wasn't a written record of them. But when we stand here and we look upon these reconstructed faces, we can learn a little bit about their stories and learn a little bit about who they were and realize that this was someone's home here.
What we are standing on is high ground next to a river. And this is a river that the flow varies over the course of the year, but it has water in it all year round. And so living close to a water source like that would be very important, all the time. Because it is high ground, when it does flood here, this is land that doesn't flood. And historically, this is land that would have stayed drier. So what you have here is high, dry ground next to a reliable water source. That attracted people. When people were, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, migrating around, stopping in camping places and moving to other places, they were coming here and stopping here periodically. When people started farming, during the Mississippian Era and started creating cities, this is where a city was developed.
How many different buildings do we think were here? Was this space really this wide open, or was there more developed in this section?
So it seems that within this area there were 10 of these round buildings, 10 houses, 5 on this side of the site and 5 on the other side of the site. There are several square buildings, like the 2 that are here, one on the mound and one across from it, and several temporary structures near the center of the site.
And how do we know what each one of these buildings are used for? How can we tell a house versus a site for a ceremonial purpose?
Evidence of cooking is a good reason to identify a house. There'll be food remains, sometimes seeds or charred food remains that have survived. And so this is a good indication of people were cooking here and they were living here. The absence of this would indicate it's something more of a ceremonial or a public function.
And where would those ceremonial or public functions happen here on this site?
Here on the site we have 2 square structures that have been rebuilt. These are political structures, and these are the buildings where your leaders would have congregated, and these are where large decisions and ceremonies would have occurred. You can kind of think of it like a capitol and a town hall and a temple kind of rolled into one building.
Tell me a little bit more about this space where we're standing here. Would this have been a very populated section, like thinking along the lines of Raleigh or Charlotte, or is this a smaller town? Where are we right now?
Well, the land has changed and the use of the land has changed. During the Mississippian use of the site, so we're talking about, from around 800 until the middle 1400s, originally this was a village site, and it was a small village site. It may have been within this palisade that you see here, or it may have been even smaller than that. Over time, this village grew. It got larger. The palisade that you see here is just the smallest one we know of, and there are other ones extending out into the prairie. So over time, the city grew, and as the city grew, people started living other places. So there were villages around here, and then this became a ceremonial center. People would come back to here for special celebrations or to bury their dead, and they were living in other places. So when you start asking about how many people were here, it really depends on when you take your snapshot. But when this was a ceremonial site, I've asked and I've been told probably 125, 130, maybe about that many people here for special celebrations.
So we're standing outside of one of the ceremonial buildings here. We know it's one of the ceremonial buildings because of the shape of it and its location. And it has a really cool construction to it. It's put together in a very specific way. This clearly had a lot of thought and effort gone into it here. So how would you build a ceremonial building like this?
So one of the main parts is these posts that are buried into the ground. Is that buried part that gives a good post hole for archaeologists to find and know where the building was and how it was shaped. Then these smaller branches, so young trees and vines, when they're still young and pliable and haven't dried up yet, they are woven in and out of these posts. The same technique as making a basket. These can be packed in. They can be quite tight woven structure. And then daub is put on top. So daub is a clay mixture mixed with grass and sand, so it's going to hold together very well, and it is packed on top to the surface. And this entire construction is called wattle and daub. And the wattle is the woven part, and the daub is the clay mixture. It acts as an insulation as well. So this building is going to be cooler in the summer and a little bit warmer in the winter when the fire is going.
And what about these pine needles? I'm looking here at...
So this is grass that can be found in the prairie. This is broom straw or switchgrass or any of these other grasses that'll dry really well. They can be bundled up and placed in layers on top of the roof here. It is waterproof. There are so many layers in here that standing inside on a very rainy day, you're not going to get wet.
All right, and so the other thing I see missing though is we don't have a chimney, we don't have a fireplace. And we know that they don't have central heating like we do in 2020. So in the middle of the winter, how do you stay warm? What do they do?
Well, there is a hole in the center of the roof at top. So when you're inside the building, you can see that clearly there is a hole in the roof. And beneath that hole is a good place to have a fire going year round. The doors themselves, people ask all the time, well, they're shorter because people have to adapt to get in, and it's very inconvenient to modern visitors. But this is a good way to keep a fire, the heat from a fire inside of the building in winter, so it doesn't rise and go out a big door.
So we think basically back to our science classes here, and we remember that heat is going to rise, so those lower doors mean that we're going to stay warmer. So they do actually have some kind of central heating. It just doesn't make a whole lot of noise and have a lot of electronics associated with it. Welcome inside of one of these ceremonial structures. We're actually on top of the mound right now, and we're inside a building that would have had a number of different purposes and been used by a number of different people. So tell me a little bit about where are we?
Well, we are specifically about 15 feet off of the ground right now. We're on top of the mound here at Town Creek. And this mound was not built in all one stage. It was built in several stages. So to back way up just a little bit, because remember we're talking about these snapshots. Mm-hmm. The first structure that was ever in this area on the grounds was an earth lodge. And we don't have a reconstructed earth lodge at Town Creek to see right now, but that was the ceremonial building at that time. It probably became old. It's a building that's made by stacking logs up and covering it with dirt. It was burned and collapsed. Instead of sweeping everything away, a wall was built around where that building had been, and it was built out of dirt. It was 5 feet tall. That wall was filled in, a basket load of dirt at a time, until it was filled to the top. That was the first mound here at Town Creek, 5 feet tall. Then a building like this was built on that level, and it was used for a long time. It also was burned. Again, instead of raking everything out of the way, dirt was added on top of it. In fact, reading through the archaeologist's notes, it appears that people were careful not to disturb the things that were left unburned, but instead to cover those and to respect, if you will, what was left behind. So over time, this mound was built up to the 15-foot level that it is now, and a structure a lot like the one that we're in right now was built here. This building served the purpose of a town hall or a capitol. It also served the purpose of a temple. It could be all of those things at the same time. Maybe only the most important people or people who had been summoned here would have been allowed in this building. In this building, a fire would have been kept burning all the time. This was a sacred fire. It would have been kept burning in here and only extinguished for special occasions.
We also see that they're kind of using the same site over and over and over again. Was the construction the same? I know we said that it was changing from that earthen structure to something like this. Do we think that people built this same sort of structure for thousands of years, or is this structure here unique to the time period that you interpret?
This building that we're in right now, and at least 3 other buildings like it, lower than us on the mound, were all built in a span of hundreds of years. And they all served the same purpose, and they were all in the same space, just on different levels as the mound got taller.
Mm-hmm. I'm standing next to something that looks almost like a table over here. What exactly is this table?
Well, it's interesting because you see benches in here also. Benches are for people to sit on when we're giving tours. The table is something that is supported by archaeology. This is something, you could call it an altar. Maybe someone important sat there, or maybe important items sat on that. We don't know. What we do know is that this building and other buildings that were on the mound had post holes where this table was at, and that this thing was here. We don't know exactly what it was used for, but it takes an important position in the room here. It's up here on this side, and the sunlight coming through the smoke hole here, it carries a different path. Twice a year, if it's not too cloudy, the sunlight lands exactly on this table at about noon.
So this table right here is something that you think actually was here, supported by archaeology. I think one of the questions that we always get at historic sites is, how do we know what we know? And also, why don't we know more? And I know for us, the truth of the matter is we really wish someone had a video camera and they went around and told us about it.
Right.
But we're kind of piecing together stories, and we know this site here, you've said, was home to a lot of different people with a lot of different traditions. So there's no way of necessarily knowing exactly what each individual group did, but I am curious. Why did they build mounds?
Wow, that is one of the questions, you know, that if you had a time machine, that is one of the things. When you leave the mound and you go out and you look around, you're on the tallest thing in the vicinity. You are above everything else. You get to look down on everything around you. And if the tall trees weren't here, you would be able to see a great distance from up here. You might feel more important. People who were on the ground, maybe who were not allowed to come up here, they would look up and they would feel that you were more important. I imagine that the mound is a status symbol. And there are other mound sites in the southeast, and they have huge mounds, 100 feet. They had vast populations supporting those mounds. We are further north and further east than a lot of those sites. And there wasn't a supporting population here for a 60 or 100 foot mound. There was a population to support a 15-foot mound. And there were people here that were following this tradition, this same tradition that was being followed. It was prevalent in the southeast at that time. And it's a status symbol. It elevates the people and the building above everything else.
And you brought up something interesting. This is a tradition that's being practiced throughout the Southeast. I think we think sometimes when we're imagining this world here of early America, we imagine these spaces few and far between. We imagine people alone in the middle of nowhere, when in reality, this is a kind of bustling urban space. There's connections. You talked about how people are out there and they have these traditions that go across time.
That is one of the earmarks of the Mississippian tradition, are these vast trade networks. So you do have centers like this that are spread far apart, but they've got trade networks set up. You know, it's this barter economy, and the idea for these cultural exchanges to happen, it was common. Yeah.
And that's always been one of my big things when we're talking about Native American societies, is it's this idea, we have this image that they're alone. They're not at all.
Mm-hmm.
These are these massive, incredible trade networks. I mean, people
you
here
have
were
to
100% aware that there were Europeans.
just look at the proliferation of projectile points.
Oh, yeah.